forever and a day. Leah had been listening at the door as Joe went on about Max's feelings for Annie, and she tried to get to Max in order to make sure that it was all lies, but the door was locked, and all she could do was sit in that room stewing in her own anger. As she sat on the side of one of the two beds in the room, Leah could hear a struggle going on in the basement, and she hoped that Joe was getting the beating he deserved, but they'd better not kill him. She hadn't put in all that work just to have him killed a few hours after she delivered him to them. She was listening to those noises when the bedroom door opened. Max was standing in the doorway, looking at her. He looked angry, but she was just grateful to have a moment alone with him. She hadn't had a chance to speak to him alone since she arrived. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. Then he rushed across the room and grabbed Leah by the arms so firmly that she couldn't help but wince with pain. And then he kissed her. As their lips met, Leah felt all of her worries melt away. Everything she'd been through over the past year and a half had boiled down to that moment, and it was worth it. She nearly melted in his arms. "Why did you look for me?" he asked her, still holding onto her arms and still with that look of anger in his eyes. "Because I love you." "I never loved you. I just needed someone who could do what you said you could do. I know that's why you took my sister. But you can't tell me that you don't love me. You can't let them decide for you, Max. You don't need to follow them around like a little dog." He smacked her across the face, and through his teeth he said to her, "Don't you call me a dog. I am part of something greater than you will ever know. I am special." She went back to him and put her hands on his face. She said, "I know you're special. You're smarter than they are. You're stronger." Max didn't respond, except to give a slight nod that seemed to be more for his own benefit than for hers. Leah looked him in the eyes and told him, "I see how strong you are. That's why I found you. That's why I did all of this." He seemed to be warming up to her. His posture loosened up, his eyes went to the ground, and he put his hands on top of hers. Then he grabbed her hands, and that anger returned to his eyes. He threw her against the wall and pressed his lips against hers so hard that it hurt her. But she knew that's what he wanted. She was still somewhat sore from being hit by the car, and he wanted to remind her of that moment. Putting a hand on his chest, Leah pushed Max away, just enough to look him in the eyes. As she did, she gave him a reassuring look and a slight nod, before telling him, "I love you." She gently kissed him, and he allowed her to. For the first time in such a long time, Leah felt safe. Discipline. That was what it always came down to when Max was growing up. His mother was a dance instructor who pushed her students to their breaking points and then told them that it wasn't good enough. Their toes didn't point properly, their extensions weren't straight enough, their facial expressions were grotesque. When he was very young, Max would sit in the corner under a table and watch his mother teach her students, watching their every move in the wall of mirrors. He watched her pull their legs up just a little bit higher, causing her students to wince with pain, and then she would criticize them for allowing their own emotions to interfere with their performance. Perfection was her goal, and no dancer was ever good enough for her. When Max was 8 years old, his mother tried to teach her son to dance. She wanted him to become something great so that her legacy could live on in the next generation. But the boy was horribly uncoordinated. He would stumble rather than spin, and slip instead of glide. He was a disappointment to her, and he could see it in her eyes as he looked into the mirrors. She told him that he took after his father. Honestly, Max wasn't sure whether she meant that as an insult or a compliment, because he admired his father. His father was strong and outspoken. He was a leader in a community of people who were inching ever closer to losing touch with their culture. Germany was as mythical to Max as Oz or Wonderland. Though he'd never set foot in Germany, Max's father often lectured people about the riches of their culture and the importance of holding on to their heritage, even as America insisted on following this melting pot philosophy. German food, German art, German ideals. Max was raised to believe that Germany was in his blood, and it was his job to spread German values across the country, to make America better by making it more like Das Vaterland. His father told him about how America was founded on German ideals, and that at its core, this country was German. It simply needed to rid itself of the vermin before it could achieve its true potential. As he grew older and learned more about American history in school, Max began to wonder how much of what his father told him was true. He wanted to believe what he had been raised to believe, but everything around him told him otherwise. When Max was 13 years old, his father was killed, shot outside of a bar after one of the drunks decided that they didn't like his lecturing. His mother took the death hard. She stopped teaching dance classes, and she tried to ease Max's pain by spending time with him, hugging him and cooking him his favorite meals. But Max didn't want any of that. He didn't want his mother. He wanted his father back, and so he held on to the lessons that his father had taught him more tightly with each passing day. He began lecturing his friend Peter about the greatness of Germany, and they started attending rallies together. Peter was a follower. He was a weak-minded boy who would follow Max anywhere he went and do whatever he said, and Max liked having that sort of power over someone. It made him feel important. But Peter was the only one who looked at Max in that way. To the adult members of the Bund, Max was a kid. He was easily pushed around. Others in the neighborhood made fun of his father, which angered Max. Nobody took him seriously, and this caused a resentment inside of Max, which grew and grew until he was cold and bitter. By the time he was 16, Max's mother had come to fear him. Max liked that feeling. He enjoyed seeing the woman who had pushed those dancers beyond their breaking point shrink away from him whenever he moved in her direction. Now he pushed her and made sure that she stayed broken. Years passed, and Max had grown tired of listening to the ramblings of the German-American Bund. Though they may have lined up with his father's beliefs, to Max they were foolish. They were not truly German, and he didn't want anything more to do with them. One night he had more than his fair share to drink at a bar in his neighborhood, and he began ranting about the fools who were drinking around him. Max and Peter both wound up with scrapes and bruises that night, but Max also caught the eye of Karl Gottschalk, who would end up recruiting him into a project that was truly German, for the betterment of Germany. Max didn't hesitate to leave his life behind. For the first time in his life, he was doing something that he believed in, and he loved being a part of it, for the most part. To Karl, Max was an underling. He was supposed to take notes and follow orders. And while Karl seemed to like Max well enough, he never allowed Max to believe that they were equals. Otto and Jutta barely noticed Max at all. They dealt with Karl while Max sat in the corner, watching Karl push Otto to the limits of his ability, until Otto could take it no longer. His notes were detailed and accurate, reporting everything that Otto told them about the dead, and the fact that Otto seemed to suffer from headaches after each session. His medicine of choice was alcohol. Karl had Max remove those comments from the records before they submitted their findings. He told Max that Otto's habits weren't important to the study. The only thing that was important to them was the information that Otto might be able to get for them, drunk or not. Maybe if Max had included that information about Otto, things would have turned out differently. Maybe they could have found real medicine for Otto's headaches, and maybe Otto wouldn't have died. But there was no way to know anything for certain. All Max knew was that Otto died, and his chance of serving the cause was in danger of slipping away. That's when he saw Leah, sitting in a bar, passing messages from the dead along to their loved ones in exchange for a drink. She was his salvation. She was the chance that Max needed to prove to the others that he was not only worthy of being respected, but he was capable of so much more than they gave him credit for. Sam had worked in his cousin's office for a long time. He knew the place well enough to walk down the hallways with his eyes closed, if he ever chose to do so. He knew the people, probably more than he really needed to in some cases, and yet the office never felt comfortable to him. He never felt at ease while he was working there. He always felt like he didn't belong there, or that he was being judged by those who worked there. As he stood behind the counter of the bookstore that Mary's father had owned, Sam felt completely at ease. The store was warm and inviting. The people who worked there treated him with respect. Mary trusted him with her father's business, and the importance of that trust was not lost on Sam. It was something which he hadn't had in a long time. The place was quiet. Sam hadn't seen a customer walk through the door for nearly an hour. Never a lazy man, he decided to sweep the floors and dust the shelves. If he couldn't make any sales, at least he could be helpful in other ways. He walked to the back office, looking for the broom and dustpan. It was the first time that Sam had seen the office, though he'd heard that Joe often spent nights there. The place looked more like a small apartment to him. There was a cot on the floor, neatly made. On the desk, Sam found some old photographs, framed by either Joe or by Mary's father. One of the pictures had Mary in it, with another girl whom he assumed was her sister. They were young and smiling, as though someone had decided to tell a joke at the precise moment that the photographer snapped their portrait. Just looking at the picture brought a smile to Sam's face. Another photo was of a little girl, no more than 2 years old. She had beautiful blonde curls and a sweet smile, but her eyes were her most mesmerizing feature. She looked directly into the camera, as though she knew who would be looking at that picture someday, and her smile was for him. Though he never knew Maggie, the photo gripped Sam's heart, and the knowledge of what happened to her broke it. When he looked down to the cot for the second time, Sam saw the deeper meaning behind it. He understood the type of pain that Joe must endure to never feel comfortable in his own home. He stared at that cot, thinking about the life that Joe once had and everything that had been taken away from him. He couldn't imagine that type of loss. Harvey's death had done its share of damage, but even that could not compare to what Joe had been through. The broom and dustpan were in the corner of the office. Sam grabbed them and left the office, closing the door behind him. As he began sweeping the floor, Sam thought about Joe and what he had been trying to accomplish by going out to New Jersey. He wasn't simply trying to help a stranger in need, he was trying to give the world purpose. He was trying to do something good so that he could be sure that something good could still exist in the world. At least this was what Sam thought. He had never been accused of being a great philosopher, so he was sure that he'd be laughed at if he ever expressed such a thought to anyone else, with the possible exception of Mary. He checked his watch. She'd been gone for over 2 hours, and there was still no sign of Joe. He knew that if Joe had called her, she would have gone back to the store by that point, so she must still be sitting in her apartment, worrying about him. He just wished that there was something more that he could do for her. The door opened and a man walked in, carrying a folder in his hands. Sam smiled politely, as he imagined any good storekeeper should. He walked toward the counter as he said, "Good morning, sir." The man walked over to the counter, looking toward the back office before asking Sam, "Is Joe here?" "I'm sorry he's out right now, but I can give him a message if you like." "How about Mary?" She's out too." The man looked at Sam as though he was wondering who he was and what he was doing in the store, before he said, "I'm Detective O'Shea. I'm a friend of Joe's." Sam smiled and nodded, saying, "I've heard of you. Mary had nothing but nice things to say." "I appreciate it, but it's important that I speak with Joe. Do you know where he is?" Sam wasn't sure that he should answer the question. He wasn't sure what the protocol would be for a situation like this. In his discomfort, his eyes drifted down to the counter. He saw his keys resting on a piece of paper. He could have sworn that they were in his pocket. "Are you all right?" O'Shea asked him. Sam grabbed his keys and put them back in his pocket, before turning his attention back to the detective and smiling. "Fine, just fine. Joe's..." "He went looking for those people, didn't he? He tracked down the Meyer girl." Sam's back was up against a wall. He didn't want to lie to the police, but if he said anything that got Joe into trouble, Mary would not be happy with him. The lack of an answer seemed to be answer enough for O'Shea. He took a deep breath before asking, "When did he leave?" "About a day ago." "And you haven't heard from him since?" Sam shook his head. "And you never thought to call the police?" Sam didn't have an answer for that question either. It wasn't his place to decide when to call the police on Joe's behalf. If that was going to happen, it would have been Mary's decision. "Do you know where he went? I mean exactly," O'Shea asked. "I know it was on the Jersey Shore," Sam replied, looking around the counter for some clue that would lead him to Joe's location. That's when he saw the paper, really saw it. It was the spot where he kept finding his keys, but he hadn't thought to look at the paper itself. Now, for the first time, Sam saw names written on the paper in Joe's handwriting. Max Weber, Karl Gottschalk, Yuta, and Otto Dorr. Leah Meyer. There were also arrows pointing from name to name, suggesting that these people were connected, but Sam didn't know how until he saw the word Nazis. His eyes froze when he saw those names. All of a sudden, he knew that Harvey had been trying to draw his attention to those people. Maybe he knew that Joe was there, and he knew that Joe was in trouble. O'Shea put his folder down on the counter and opened it. He began pulling out police files with names that matched the names that Joe had written down. "These are the people that he went after?" Sam asked, looking at the files more for the photographs than anything else. Each of the people there, with the exception of Otto Dorr, had a mugshot to go along with them. "Yes," O'Shea replied, flipping through pages of police records. "The question is, what do they have to do with the New Jersey shore?" "There's a house. I think one of them inherited it," Sam told him, looking into the eyes of Carl Gottschalk's photo. They were the eyes of a deeply disturbed man. "Mary would know more. She would be able to tell you exactly where he went." "Then call her. Get her down here." Sam nodded, but found it hard to look away from the pictures. Now that he knew that Harvey was somehow involved in this mess, he wanted to know how. He wanted to know if these people had something to do with what Joe felt, the monster under the bed. He snapped himself out of that thought and reached for the phone, dialing it while barely even looking at the numbers on the dial. As he waited for the phone to ring and Mary to answer, the store's front door opened and a man walked in, carrying his own stack of papers. The man looked only vaguely familiar to Sam as they locked eyes, and the man asked Sam, "Where's Joe?" As soon as she returned to her apartment, Mary rushed to clean herself up and make herself presentable, while always ensuring that she would be able to hear the telephone ring. She really didn't believe that Joe would go to her apartment if he came home. She knew that there was a chance that he might stop by his own apartment before going to the bookstore, or if he was home at a late enough hour, to the Capitol. But he might call her if he got into trouble, so she wanted to be prepared just in case. After she had freshened up, Mary went to the kitchen and cooked herself a reasonable breakfast. She then sat at the kitchen table, staring at her food, but lacking the will to eat it. Since she trusted Sam to run the store, and to let her know if Joe called or came home, Mary's guard had come down, and the restless night that she'd had began to catch up with her. Before she knew it, Mary was asleep at the table. Her dream was not filled with violent images or flashes of her worries about Joe. Instead, it was a vivid dream of memories. She remembered all of the people that she had loved and how they had left her. She remembered her mother going on and on about politics and how the world must be ending because the people in it were so out of control. Mary could practically hear her mother's voice, warning Mary to watch out for that FDR because he was a man who enjoyed having power and he wasn't likely to give it up very easily. And then she remembered her mother's grave in the cold of winter, snow drifting down from the gray sky. The trees looked gray. The headstones around her were gray. Everything seemed muted, and her mother's voice faded into silence. She remembered her father laughing with her next to a warm fire. When she was a child, he would read her classic stories, acting out each character with a different voice or accent. She remembered him giving Captain Hook a French accent on one particular night, and how they had laughed as he struggled to hold on to that accent throughout the entire story. His grave was next to her mother's. The memory of the warm fire was replaced by the chill of a cold breeze. And then there was screaming. Not the type of screaming that you would expect from a person being hunted down and murdered, but the type of screaming that you would expect to hear from a girl whose little sister has been going through her things. When she was younger, all Mary wanted was to be like her big sister, Norma. She wanted to spend time with Norma's friends and play the same games. When they were very young, this was fine with Norma. But as Norma grew older, she didn't want Mary pestering her and her friends all the time. Around the time Norma turned 15, she was spending a lot of time with two other girls from her class who thought it was fun to tease Mary. Rather than simply shoo Mary away as Norma would prefer, they would promise to let her join them as long as she did everything that they told her to do. Mary was eager to please them, so she would fetch them snacks or do their chores, while Norma tolerated having her around. One afternoon, the older girls were at Norma and Mary's house when they saw Mary's oldest and favorite doll sitting on her bed. They started laughing at her for being such a child, all while Norma stood by and said nothing. Then the girls told Mary that if she wanted to be like the older girls and spend time with them, she would have to give up such childish things. They told her that if she threw her doll into the fire, she could be a member of their club once and for all. Mary loved that doll. It was given to her by her grandmother when she was only 2 months old, and she had slept with that doll every night throughout her childhood. But as much as she loved that doll, Mary loved Norma more. She wanted to finally be a part of her sister's life without having to earn her place on a daily basis, so she threw her doll into the fire. The older girls laughed, and Norma stood next to them saying nothing as she stared at the fire, watching the doll burn. Mary was unable to contain her tears. She started sobbing and ran to her bedroom, crying into her pillow. She could hear the older girls laughing at her from the other room, and then she heard another door slam. It was the door to Norma's room, shutting out the laughter of Norma's friends. The laughing from the other girls eventually died down, and they must have gone home. Mary didn't pay them any attention. She did, however, hear the sound of crying coming from Norma's room. Norma didn't spend much time with those other girls after that. She made more time for Mary for a while, but she was growing up, and there was no way for their worlds to remain as close and connected as they had once been. Mary eventually came to accept that, but deep down inside, she never stopped wishing that she could have caught up to Norma in age and shared the same sort of bond that they had as little girls. She stood alone over Norma's grave, with the smell of a distant fire hanging in the air. She would happily throw that doll into the fire again if only she could have her sister back. Mary was not the type of person to tell people that she loved them very easily. She assumed that those who were very close to her would know how she felt, and she was not the type of person who told every friend and neighbor that she loved them. Perhaps she was cold-hearted, but the word meant something to her. If she was going to say it, she was going to mean it with every fiber of her being. The very first day that she met her niece, Mary leaned close to that tiny creature and whispered into Maggie's ear how she felt. It was immediate. There was something about Maggie which could pull a person in and make them love her, whether they were related to the girl or not. She was infectious. Simply thinking about Maggie could put a smile on Mary's face, and being in the same room with her niece gave Mary a feeling that she couldn't get anywhere else. She didn't feel like the silly child that she usually saw herself as. When she was with Maggie, she felt like the best version of herself. She felt like the mature, intelligent, beautiful, strong person that Maggie saw in her, even if she didn't deserve to feel that way. That was only one of Maggie's gifts. The girl was smart and caring and beautiful, but the way she could make someone feel completely at ease and lift their spirits even on the worst day was something that Mary had never seen in anyone else. Perhaps she could have tolerated the loss of everyone else if only Maggie were there to make her feel better. But every time she so much as thought of her niece's death, Mary's heart shattered into 100 pieces, and she could barely contain her tears. Her grave looked so small, though the headstone was the same size as the others. It should have looked the same as everyone else's, but as Mary stood at that grave, she couldn't help but think about how tiny it was. She felt stupid for thinking it. She felt helpless at her inability to do anything to save Maggie, and she felt childish for feeling that way when she wasn't even in the same state on the night that Maggie died. To the side of Maggie's grave, there were 2 holes, just waiting to be filled by more bodies. Eventually, everyone died. It was only a matter of time before she was completely alone in the world. A clash of thunder roared across the sky in her dream, and Mary nearly fell out of her chair as she woke up in the kitchen of her apartment. Her telephone was ringing. Though she was still partially asleep and felt as though she might fall over at any moment, Mary rushed toward the phone and picked up the receiver, hoping to hear Joe's voice on the other end of the line. "Joe?" she said into the phone, sounding groggier than she would have liked. There was a pause before Sam's voice came over the other end of the line, and he said, "Mary, it's me. You need to get down to the store as soon as you can." "Why? What's happened?" "It's not like that, Mary. I promise I haven't heard anything from Joe yet, but there's a detective here who wants to speak with you." Mary didn't need to ask any other questions. She knew who the detective was, and she knew what he wanted to talk to her about. She was already hanging up the phone as she said, "I'm on my way." Mary hurried to grab her coat and handbag before rushing out the door. Before she knew it, she was on the sidewalk, running toward the bookstore as quickly as her feet would allow. Oh, how Mary wished that she was a child again, wearing a child's clothes and shoes, so that she could race down the street without worrying about breaking her ankle in the process. She heard several people on the street telling her to watch where she was going as she passed them. Some told her to slow down. One man asked her if she was all right, but she didn't even stop for him. She didn't care what any of those people had to say. She needed to get to the store. When she reached the entrance to the bookstore, Mary expected to walk inside, head straight to the nearest map of New Jersey, and point out where Joe had gone. What she didn't expect was to walk into the store and find Sam and Michael O'Shea standing by the counter, going over police files with Roy Mitchell. She froze when she saw him standing there, wondering whether or not she wanted to say a single word as long as he was in the store. She saw all of the papers spread out on the counter, and she knew that whatever Sam had to say, Roy already knew. She hated that fact. "Why are you here?" she asked Roy, not even trying to hide the distrust in her voice. "Run out of stories to write? Come looking for a new way to exploit Joe?" "Actually, I was fired this morning," Roy told her in a matter-of-fact tone. "And I'll have you know, Joe and I were working together on this." She knew that. Joe told her that he had worked with Roy on finding the bakery, and that Roy was the one who actually went inside of it. But her distrust of Roy ran deep, and she couldn't bring herself to let it go. Sam walked to her and put an arm around her, bringing her back to the counter and telling her, "He's been helpful. With what he knows and what we know, we're finally starting to put some of this together." Mary was curious and asked, "Some of what?" "Harvey, Annalise Meyer, the Germans, all of it," Sam explained. He showed her the files that Michael brought with him and told her, "These are the people that Joe's been looking into. Max Weber was Leah's boyfriend. He took her and skipped town with Carl Gottschalk and Uta Dorr. For a while, they were staying above the Dorr Bakery." Mary nodded as she studied the mugshots and said, "Joe told me about the bakery. They found the room where they were holding Leah. She didn't go willingly." "That's putting it mildly," Roy nodded. Sam continued, saying, "Remember what Joe told us about Annalise and Leah, how they spoke to the dead?" Mary nodded. "Well, so did this man." Sam handed her the file on Otto Duer and said, "Except, well, he died. So they needed to find someone who could talk to the dead, someone to take his place. That's where Leah came in." "But Joe said that she couldn't do that anymore, and neither could Annalise." "They didn't know that when they took her." Mary found herself staring at the picture of Uta Dorr, taking in the harshness of her face and the goiter on her neck. She understood where they were going with what they were telling her. If they had Joe, he might be the closest thing they had to someone who could speak to the dead. They wouldn't kill him. They might torture him, but they wouldn't kill him. She turned her eyes to Sam and asked, "How do you know that they need to speak to the dead? And what does Harvey have to do with this?" "My keys. Remember how we found them on the counter, on top of this piece of paper?" Sam asked her, holding up Joe's notes. "It happened again after you left. I just didn't understand it until Detective O'Shea showed me these files. Harvey was with Joe. Those people are what he was warning me about." "The monster?" she asked. Sam nodded, but Mary still didn't understand how Harvey fit into the picture. Sam told her, "Remember how I told you that Harvey's death wasn't listed with the others in the newspapers?" Mary nodded. "Well, it turns out his wasn't the only death that wasn't reported. There were 4 others, Germans who were on the Hindenburg when it crashed." "But why didn't anyone say anything?" "Because those Germans weren't listed on the passenger manifest. They weren't supposed to be on the ship when it exploded," Sam explained, before trailing off. He took a deep breath before telling her, "And because they were seen after the crash, walking away from the chaos. If they died, Harvey was seen too. That's why nobody reported his death right away." Mary finally understood and nodded. She turned all of these facts around in her head, trying to see how all of the pieces fit together, though it seemed impossible to connect everything that happened and all of the people. She didn't understand how they could be sure that those dead Germans were related to the living Germans that Joe was following. Except Harvey was at that house with those people. Somehow, it was all connected. There's no such thing as a coincidence. That's what Joe was always saying, though she'd never put much belief in that theory. Now it was being proven right before her eyes. She turned to Sam, with a question suddenly springing to mind, and asked him, How do we know about those dead Germans? Who told you? Sam looked to Roy and said, He did. Roy gave Mary a wink as he told her, I was looking into Harvey's death, trying to figure out how someone could die there that night and go completely overlooked. Turns out there were others on the base experiencing strange things too, and being written off as having suffered some sort of trauma. The higher-ups either didn't believe them or didn't want to acknowledge what was happening. They also didn't want people asking questions and stirring up fear of undocumented passengers from Germany sneaking into our country. The paranoia surrounding spies would be like wildfire, spreading all over the country, and they didn't want that. They wanted a controlled investigation. But then stories about ghosts started to spread, so they swept the deaths under the rug and got rid of anyone who might start telling stories around the campfire. Told them they were crazy and kicked them to the curb. Mary's eyes went to Sam to see how he reacted to that bit of news. She was growing angry and asked, They knew? Sam nodded to her, and his eyes went down to the counter. He was undoubtedly thinking about all of the pain that he could have been spared, if only. I had a visit from a government agent yesterday, Michael cut in. They've suspected that Karl Gottschalk might be a German spy for a while now, but they'd lost track of him. When I started asking questions and calling around to get my hands on his files, they got their first lead in a long time. It was the door name that pulled everything together. It tied back to some of the mail that was aboard the Hindenburg when it crashed and delivered after the explosion. Until now, the government just thought they were a couple of innocent Germans running a bakery. But as soon as you tell me where Joe went, I'll call them and they'll send their men. Avon by the Sea, Mary told him. The baker inherited a house from his mother. It's under the same last name. Michael didn't waste any time before heading to the office to make his phone call. Mary took another moment to examine the papers on the counter. As she looked through them, she came across Roy's notes about the Hindenburg and the ghosts who were seen that night. She then turned to Roy and asked him, You were looking into Harvey's death? Why? How did you know? Did Joe tell you? Roy's eyes went from Mary to Sam and then down to the floor. He then told her, I overheard a conversation in the alley. Something that I never wanted to hear, but there it was, so I decided to get some answers. Mary couldn't tell whether or not this news was as much of a surprise to Sam as it was to her. She stepped away from the counter, but never looked in his direction. She kept her eyes on Roy. When his eyes met hers, he must have seen the anger that she was feeling. It would be hard for anyone to miss it because it was so strong and overwhelming that she could barely keep from screaming. Roy was about to say something to her, but he was cut off by the slap that landed across his face. She didn't even realize that she had done it at first, but when she did, she wasn't sorry. She slapped him again and again, but soon discovered that it wasn't helping. She hated him. I never meant any harm, he told her. People deserve answers. Sam deserves answers. And Christopher. You spoke to my cousin, Sam asked him. Roy could only nod, knowing that the hole he was in was quickly growing deeper. Mary shook her head in disbelief. She had a pained expression on her face as she asked, What makes a person as horrible as you? She could feel Sam's arm around her, urging her to walk away from Roy, but Mary didn't take her eyes off of Roy before saying, Get out. I want you out of my store and out of my life. Mary, it's all right, Sam told her. It's not all right. She was fuming, fists balled and jaw clenched. She stepped toward Roy and told him, If it wasn't for you, none of this would be happening. If it wasn't for that article. I don't understand why you insist on hurting the people I love. Michael walked out of the office before Roy could respond and told them, The government has men on their way to the house now. I don't get the sense that they're a very well-organized bunch, so I think that if I leave now, I might be able to make it there in time to meet them. As Michael walked toward the door, Roy turned to follow and said, I'll come along for the ride. You should stay here, O'Shea replied. I'm honestly not even sure they want me there. Can't we all go? Mary asked. Michael seemed far more sympathetic toward her than toward Roy when he told her, I can't drag you into a dangerous situation like that. I promise we'll phone as soon as anything happens. He then turned to Roy and gave him a questioning look. In return, Roy gave him a reluctant nod, letting Michael know that he would stay behind. With that settled, Michael walked out of the store, leaving Roy alone with Mary and Sam. The store fell silent. Mary had nothing to say to, or in front of, Roy. He took the hint, and after a moment of standing in awkward silence, he said, "Well, if you'll just tell Joe that I stopped by." He then turned and started to walk toward the door. Mary was eager to see him go, but Sam wasn't as upset as she was. He asked Roy, "What are you going to do?" "What I do best," Roy smirked. "Break promises, lie, and go where I'm not wanted." He gave Sam a quick nod goodbye, and then walked out of the store, leaving Mary and Sam alone. After all of the fuss and commotion, the store seemed even more empty than normal, and Mary wasn't even sure what she should do next. She turned to Sam, feeling the worry in her stomach growing tighter. He put his arms around her, calming her and whispering to her, "It's all right." She shook her head and said to him, I'm sorry that he went poking around your life like that. It's my fault." The fact that Sam wasn't more upset surprised her. He had been so worried about telling her about his cousin that night outside of the Capitol. But now, he seemed fine with his story in the hands of a loathsome reporter. "It's finally starting to make sense," Sam told her. "Not the sort of sense that I might prefer, mind you. But in some strange way, maybe it's for the best. Nothing that man does is for the best. I'm not sure that he's as bad as you think he is." Mary didn't want to argue about Roy Mitchell anymore. She wanted to forget all about him if that was at all possible. So she turned her attention to the papers on the counter, which both Roy and Michael seemed to forget on their way out of the bookstore. She began skimming through the papers, trying her best to understand how any of it made sense. Each connection seemed random to her. Harvey's connection to the people that Joe was tracking down. The connection between the dead Germans from the Hindenburg and those living in New Jersey. She didn't imagine that any of the evidence could possibly hold up in a court of law, and yet there were fine threads connecting everything. When she picked up the police file on Otto Dorr and began to skim it, Mary didn't find much to interest her. There wasn't even a picture of the man who could apparently speak with the dead. But what she did find as she read his file was one more of those fine threads. As she read it, she couldn't help but gasp. Yuta Dorr was not a happy woman. She hadn't been a happy child, and she doubted that anything would change anytime soon. She had only a vague memory of what happiness felt like. It was a memory from when she was very young, living in Germany, surrounded by friends and family. It was her home. It was the place she loved the most in the world. Her parents moved to America when Yuta was still very young, and those memories of her home became her only connection to the life that she'd once had. Those images were seen through the eyes of an innocent child and purified through the years, removing anything that might have been unpleasant. All that was left was the idea of a place that was good and pure, while life in America only seemed to grow more ugly and more unbearable with each passing year. No matter how long she lived in America, Yuta never considered it her home. She preferred the company of other Germans. She preferred German food. She preferred German cinema. Though her parents probably wouldn't have minded one bit if she'd married an Irishman or some other disgusting person, Yuta never would have dreamed of it. She couldn't imagine putting up with those accents or the annoying traditions that all of those other people seemed to have. They struck her as stupid, and she preferred to honor a culture that was rich and pure. It wasn't simply that she was familiar with her own culture, it was that her culture was better than all of the others. Yuta met Otto Dorr when she was 17 years old. His family lived in her neighborhood, and had also come from Germany when Otto was a small child. They were a little bit more wealthy than her family, and at first she found Otto to be a little strange, but since her parents hadn't moved to a German neighborhood, Yuta had to make do with what she had, and strange was preferable to disgusting. Otto didn't surround himself with a lot of friends. The first time Yuta noticed him, he was sitting by himself, eating his lunch, staring off into the distance, as though he was trying his hardest to avoid looking at someone. Every so often, he would clench his jaw or shake his head, and Yuta assumed that he was merely deep in thought. Eventually, she started speaking with him. He didn't seem very interested in her at first, but she didn't give him much say in the matter. Whether he wanted to talk to her or not, she would find him and insist that they share a meal or walk down the street together. When they got married, neither one of them was head over heels in love with the other. They got married because it was what people did. She didn't want to end up a spinster, and he didn't want to put up with his mother pestering him to stop talking to himself and meet a nice girl. His mother didn't know that he had inherited his grandfather's gift. He'd grown up in a house that was ashamed of his grandfather. One of the reasons why they moved out of Germany was because of that reputation, which the family just assumed was some sort of scheme to get money out of people. When they opened the bakery, Yuta and Otto discovered that they did have something in common after all. Both of them enjoyed baking. She enjoyed the connection that it gave her to her culture and the discipline involved. Everything was measured precisely, everything baked for a specific amount of time. There was a firm routine of waking up at an early hour before most of the city would dream of waking and getting to work. At the end of the day, she could take pride in what she created. It was hers. Otto enjoyed the solitude. When he was baking, he could tune out the rest of the world. Because everything was so carefully measured and timed, he could follow instructions without putting much thought behind it. He could simply allow his mind to drift and ignore whatever was going on around him. It wasn't until their second year of marriage that Yuta saw Otto talking to himself in the kitchen just after closing. He wasn't just mumbling to himself, he was acting as though someone else was in the room with him, and he was holding a conversation with that person. Naturally, she thought he was crazy. She cursed him and told him that he was a worthless fool. She hated her life even more than ever because she was stuck with this lunatic. She hated her parents for bringing her to America. She hated the Americans for keeping her so isolated from her own kind. The only reason that she didn't poison everything that she baked and sold was because she didn't want to be locked away, unable to avoid the filth around her. This was how Otto and Yuta Dor lived their lives, for years. He tried explaining himself to her. He tried showing her what he could do, but she thought that he was a small, weak, pathetic man whose mind was as feeble as his body. And Otto was growing more tired by the day. He couldn't sleep without dreaming of the dead, and the only way that he could function throughout the day was to drown out the ghosts by drinking. Alcohol fogged up his mind, just enough to keep him from hearing them. Yuta was involved with some of the German organizations in America. The German-American Bund was the most popular, and she went to some of their rallies, but nothing compared to her real home and her real people. The German-Americans might put on a good show, but they were not her people. They were children playing make-believe, and telling them so on one occasion caused quite a stir, resulting in Yuta being arrested and hauled down to jail. Otto picked her up and took her home, and he didn't even seem to care what had happened to her. They had become nothing more than roommates, sharing a home and a business together, and waiting for their suffering to end. One day, a man walked into the bakery and asked to speak with Otto. The man had heard stories about Otto's grandfather back in Germany, and he wanted to ask Otto questions about his grandfather's ability to speak with the dead. The man was German, a real German. For the first time in their relationship, Yuta took pride in her husband. Where she had seen nothing but insanity before, she now saw a valuable gift. It was something that would connect them to Germany once again, and possibly allow them to return to her home at some point if she could manage the opportunity properly. The only problem was Otto. He didn't mention his ability. He didn't tell the man that he could speak to the dead. Yuta had to do that for him, and though Otto was uncomfortable with the topic, he was not a liar, and he did not accuse his wife of being one. Without much say in the matter, he had been dragged into a German research project, which focused on obtaining military intelligence through supernatural means. That meant that his ability, which he had tried so hard to ignore for as long as he could remember, was being tested and pushed to its limits. Carl was sent to manage Otto's case on a full-time basis. At first, they started out with light experimentation. Otto would spend 2 or 3 hours a day being asked questions and writing down what he saw or heard around him. Then it became 4 or 5 hours of deeply focusing on the ghosts, and that is when his headaches started. They began with a throbbing behind his right eye and then spread until the pain was shooting all the way to the back of his skull, and the more work he put in, the more painful those headaches became. Drinking drowned out the ghosts. When he was drunk, he couldn't hear them or see them. All he could hear at that point was his wife yelling at him and telling him how proud he should be for once in his worthless life. There were some nights when he just needed to get as far away from her as he possibly could, because he worried that he would finally break and strangle her to death with his bare hands. The Hindenburg was the big event. It was the moment when Otto was asked to move beyond listening to the ghosts around him and focus on calling specific ghosts to him. He had never tried anything like it before, but Carl pressed him. He gave Otto objects which belonged to 4 people who died in the crash and held strong personal meaning to those people. The items still smelled of the fire when Otto got his hands on them. Holding and smelling those objects connected Otto to the ghosts in a way that he had never experienced before. He could hear them more clearly than ever. He could see what they saw as they died. He could feel what they felt, as though his own skin were burning. Carl marked the experiment as a great success and seemed thrilled with their findings, but Otto was less enthusiastic. His head hurt more than ever. His skin felt sunburned for hours after the experiment. The voices echoed in his head, and all he wanted was some peace and quiet. Otto drove quite a distance that night before finally stopping to drink his mind silent. It took more alcohol than usual to accomplish the job this time, and by the time he got back into his car, it was pouring outside. Otto didn't make it home that night. He died when his car crashed through the side of a florist shop, taking a woman and her small daughter with him to the grave.
This is the voice of the Embers, where stories burn.